There's a name that echoes through women's basketball history that most people don't actually know. Cheryl Miller isn't just a coach, and she's definitely not just someone's mentor standing on the sidelines. She's a figure who fundamentally changed how the sport operates, yet somehow remains one of the most underestimated pioneers in athletic history. What you're about to hear goes beyond the highlight reels and the casual mentions in documentaries. This is about a woman who demanded respect when the entire system told her to accept less, and what happened when she refused to back down. Let's start with something most people completely miss. When Cheryl Miller was playing, she wasn't just good, she was transcendent. She dominated the court in a way that made people question what they thought was possible in women's sports. But here's where the story gets interesting. She didn't just fade away quietly like so many athletes do. She strategically stepped back, and that decision was far more calculated than anyone realized. The woman was already thinking like a leader while everyone else was still watching her play. She was studying the system, understanding the gaps, and preparing for a moment when she could actually change things from a position of power. That moment came, but not before she made a move that shook the entire industry. When negotiations began for her involvement in basketball, Cheryl didn't ask for what she thought she deserved. She asked for what she knew the sport needed to acknowledge. Here's the crucial part that gets glossed over. She demanded a deal that exceeded what her brother Reggie was making. Now, Reggie Miller is a legend in his own right. Hall of Fame career, iconic moments, decades of relevance. But Cheryl walked into that negotiation room and said essentially, "I'm not competing for scraps while he sits at the table with the big money." That wasn't arrogance. That was a statement. She was forcing the sport to confront the reality that women's contributions had been systematically undervalued, and she wasn't going to participate in that system anymore unless things changed. The boldness of that move can't be overstated. Most people in her position would have been grateful for whatever offer came their way. She used her leverage differently. She used it to set a precedent. What happened next is where things really get interesting, because that's when Caitlin Clark entered the picture, and not in the way you probably think. Everyone knows Caitlin Clark is this generational talent who burst onto the scene. What they don't know is the influence happening behind the scenes. Cheryl became something more than a mentor to Caitlin. She became the voice that whispered truths about the sport, about expectations, about what it means to carry the weight of being a pioneer yourself. Caitlin has spoken about this connection multiple times, but people listen without really hearing. She talks about Cheryl's energy, her infectious outlook, the genuine conversations they had. Those aren't casual compliments. That's someone saying, "This woman shaped how I see my own career." Cheryl taught Caitlin something that couldn't be taught in a textbook or learned by watching game film. She taught her how to navigate being the best while the system tries to convince you that's not quite enough.
Before going further, if you're enjoying this video, don't forget to smash that subscribe button. It really helps us keep bringing you the content you love. Share this video with your friends so they don't miss out on all the drama and excitement.
That lesson became everything in Caitlin's career, whether people realized where it came from or not. The decision Cheryl made to coach without compensation, and yes, that's something that actually happened in women's basketball, wasn't a sacrifice born from desperation. It was a choice made from a position of principle. She could have demanded the salary she deserved. Instead, she walked into Phoenix and called it what it was, a full circle moment. She was going home, she was building something, and the money mattered less than the mission. But here's what people don't understand about that choice. When you're as accomplished as Cheryl Miller, when you've already proven yourself in every possible way, you can make that kind of decision from a place of genuine power. She wasn't settling, she was choosing. Those are completely different things. She talked about the joy of working with elite players, the thrill of being around greatness, the honor of shaping the next generation. That's not humble talk from someone who had no other options. That's someone who had already won the game at a different level and was now playing to change the rules. The coaching philosophy that emerged from Cheryl's work was unlike anything women's basketball had seen before. She didn't just develop players, she developed warriors. There's a difference. When young athletes come through the system, they learn fundamentals. They learn the game, but Cheryl taught something deeper. She taught them to recognize the exact moment when a run can be stopped. She taught them to understand that at a certain level, your confidence becomes your most powerful weapon. She built an environment where mistakes weren't just corrected, they were analyzed and transformed into tactical intelligence. As these players matured under her guidance, something remarkable happened. They didn't just get better at basketball. They became the kind of players who could change the outcome of games not through individual brilliance, but through an almost supernatural understanding of what was about to happen. That's not natural talent, that's development, that's coaching. That's Cheryl Miller's fingerprint all over the sport. Now let's talk about something that most people completely overlook, the facilities question. When Cheryl took over in Phoenix, she inherited, or rather was given access to training facilities that most programs can only dream about. But here's the thing that made this significant. She knew something that the rest of the industry was only beginning to understand. The equipment, the space, the resources, these things send a message. They tell players that they matter. They tell the world that women's basketball is worth investing in at the highest level. Cheryl talked about how this facility surpassed what maybe 98% of even NBA players had access to. That wasn't an exaggeration meant to inspire. That was a statement about inequality finally being addressed. The investment wasn't just about better training. It was about drawing a line in the sand and saying that women's sports deserve to compete on the same level as men's sports when it came to infrastructure and resources. That was Cheryl's subtle way of continuing the fight she started in those negotiation rooms years earlier. She wasn't just coaching anymore. She was building a monument to what investment in women's athletics could look like. Looking toward the future, Cheryl's vision extends far beyond the next season or the next championship. She sees something in the emerging generation of athletes that most people are still blind to. These young players coming through the system aren't just talented, they're ferocious. They're fearless in a way that previous generations weren't, partly because of the foundation that people like Cheryl spent decades laying. She talks about watching them develop with an almost scientific precision. When they're young, they learn, they make mistakes, they correct course, but as they mature, something shifts. They develop the ability to read a game in real time, to understand momentum, to execute decisions under pressure that would paralyze most players. Cheryl recognized that this wasn't just athletic development. This was the evolution of the sport itself. The younger generation is playing a different game because the foundation has finally become sturdy enough to support it. They're not fighting for respect anymore. They're simply playing at the highest level because that's what's expected. That shift is generational, and Cheryl Miller positioned herself at the exact center of it. The community aspect of what Cheryl built in Phoenix is something that deserves its own conversation. She talks about the foundation that these legendary players created, the strength that comes from having players around you who genuinely know what excellence looks like because they've lived it. But it goes deeper than that. She talks about people joining the team and feeling immediately welcomed into a community. That's not an accident, that's intentional culture building. Cheryl understood that women's basketball had always suffered from a sense of isolation. The sport didn't have the massive fan base that men's basketball enjoyed. The media coverage was sparse, the endorsement deals were smaller, but what it could have was community. What it could have was a movement, so she built that. She created an environment where players didn't just play for a team, they became part of something larger, they became part of a legacy. The fan support that emerged from that approach wasn't manufactured through clever marketing. It came from genuine connection. People supported Cheryl's team because they felt like they were part of something real, something that mattered beyond wins and losses. There's a moment in recent basketball history that doesn't get nearly enough attention, and it involves the tension between intensity and sustainability in women's sports. Caitlin Clark, despite her incredible talent and her seemingly endless energy, spoke openly about the cumulative effect of relentless competition. She acknowledged the emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion that comes with maintaining that level of performance. Most athletes hide that. They pretend everything's fine. They smile for the cameras and talk about how much they love the game. Caitlin didn't do that, and you can bet that conversation was informed by lessons she learned from Cheryl. Because Cheryl had lived through the same thing decades earlier and she understood something crucial: acknowledging the cost of greatness isn't weakness. It's honesty. It's the kind of clarity that separates people who burn out from people who build legacies. Cheryl taught by example that you could demand respect, you could excel at the highest level, and you could also acknowledge the toll. That integration of authenticity with excellence became part of the culture she created. The untold part of Cheryl Miller's story, the part that rarely makes it into mainstream sports narratives, is about a woman who was systematically underestimated by an industry that claimed to celebrate her. She was the best player in the world at her peak, but the world didn't quite know how to handle that when it came in a woman's body. So they celebrated her athleticism while simultaneously marginalizing her influence. She was allowed to be great on the court, but her voice in rooms where decisions were made, that took longer. That required her to demand a seat at the table in ways that her male counterparts never had to. Reggie Miller's career was celebrated at every turn. Cheryl Miller's career was celebrated, yes, but in a way that felt almost separate from the sport itself, like she was a remarkable anomaly rather than a pioneer who fundamentally shaped everything that came after. That gap between how she was perceived and what she actually accomplished is the real story that hasn't been told. What makes Cheryl's approach to leadership so revolutionary is that she didn't try to become more like the men who ran sports. She created a different model entirely. She was tough in negotiations, yes, but not in a way that mimicked masculine aggression. She was visionary, but not in the way that previous male coaches had been visionary. She built something that had its own character, its own philosophy, its own standards. When she talked about needing negotiators with courage to defend their rights, she was talking about a specific kind of strength. The strength to know your value and refuse to accept less. The strength to look at an entire industry and say, "This is broken and I'm not going to pretend it's fine." The strength to build something better instead of just complaining about what's broken. That's a different flavor of leadership than what typically gets celebrated in sports, and that's exactly why it was so powerful. The ripple effect of Cheryl's work is just beginning to be felt across women's sports broadly. When you have someone who refuses to accept the scraps that the system offers, who instead demands a transformation of the system itself, it changes the conversation for everyone who comes after. Caitlin Clark benefited from that shift. The next generation of players will benefit even more, but it's not just about basketball. It's about a woman who understood that her individual excellence could be weaponized for collective change. She could have cashed out, accepted a comfortable position, and faded into the background like so many other great athletes do. Instead, she chose to stay in the arena to keep fighting, to keep building. That choice, repeated over decades, becomes a movement. Looking at Cheryl's current role in women's basketball, what stands out is how she's positioned herself as a bridge between eras. She's old enough to remember when women's sports were genuinely invisible. She's young enough and relevant enough to shape what women's sports are becoming. That unique position is rare, and she's used it deliberately. She surrounds herself with players and colleagues who represent different generations, different styles, different approaches to the game. She absorbs their energy and feeds it back to them transformed. That's not just coaching, that's leadership at the highest level. The financial conversation around women's sports is always uncomfortable, and Cheryl doesn't shy away from that discomfort. She talks about how investment matters, how the facilities and resources available to her team send a message to the entire sport. But she frames it in a way that transcends the usual complaints about the pay gap. She's not asking for charity. She's not asking for pity. She's pointing out that when you actually invest in women's sports the way you invest in men's sports, the results speak for themselves. Better training leads to better play. Better resources lead to better preparation. Excellence is a product of commitment, and commitment is demonstrated through resources. When Cheryl points out that her team's facility exceeds what most NBA players have access to, she's not bragging. She's documenting what becomes possible when someone actually decides that women's basketball deserves the best. The emotional intelligence that Cheryl brings to her work is something that gets overlooked in discussions that focus too heavily on strategy and tactics. She talks about her players with genuine affection. She talks about Jennifer Gillum with admiration. She talks about Michelle Timms with respect. These aren't throwaway comments. They're reflections of someone who sees her players as whole people, not just assets on a roster. That approach creates loyalty that goes beyond what contracts can enforce. Players want to play for her because they feel seen, understood, and valued. That's a kind of leadership that produces results you can't manufacture through tactics alone. There's been some speculation and discussion online about Cheryl's relationship with various NBA figures, including her brother Reggie and his connections to the broader sports world. Rumors suggest that there's been tension around recognition and resources, with some suggesting that Cheryl has always fought harder for acknowledgement than Reggie ever had to. Reports claim that this dynamic actually informed how she approached negotiating her own deals and mentoring younger players. The exact nature of any disagreements or discussions remains largely private, but what's been said is that Cheryl has always been the one pushing the industry to do better, while Reggie benefited from a system that was already built in his favor. Whether or not that created friction, it certainly created motivation. Cheryl's drive to change the system seems informed by a lifetime of watching how much easier things were for men in sports, even men in her own family. As you sit with all of this information, consider what it means that someone of Cheryl Miller's stature and accomplishments had to fight as hard as she did for basic respect and fair compensation. Consider what it means that her mentoring of someone like Caitlin Clark had to happen largely behind the scenes, with her influence felt more than seen in public coverage. Consider what it means that we're still having conversations about facilities and resources in women's sports as though they're novel ideas rather than basic standards of equality. Cheryl Miller's legacy isn't just about basketball. It's about a woman who saw a broken system and decided she had the power to fix it, and then spent decades doing exactly that, often without the recognition she deserved. The future of women's basketball is being shaped right now by players who grew up watching what Cheryl built. They're not fighting to prove that women's basketball matters because she already did that work. They're simply playing at the highest level, knowing that the foundation is there to support them. That's the real victory. That's the shift. And it traces back to a woman who refused to negotiate downward, who demanded to be in the room where decisions were made, and who used every platform she had to insist that women's sports deserved better. In 10 years, 20 years, when people talk about the turning point in women's basketball, they'll be talking about moments that Cheryl Miller created, moves she made, and a culture she built. And hopefully, by then, everyone will know her name not just as a great player or a respected coach, but as the architect of real, systemic change.